Every faith community that's recognized as a legal entity must show that they have a set of bylaws for their own self-governance. Let's face it though, this is probably the last committee that anybody volunteers for, right? But bylaws are so important. I mean, they can define how it is that you hire a new pastor, or lay out how you choose board members, or even define how you understand the atonement, for instance. And I think even more important, bylaws can lay out rules and regulations for how people conduct themselves, and especially how they treat one another. I mean, let's face it, even in faith communities, the feathers can get ruffled, right? The fur can get fluffed. Our nose gets bent out of joint, or I don't know, what other things can we say? Sometimes we get our panties in a wad over something that happens. Nothing is more damaging to the kingdom of God than when sparks fly between members of the same faith community, whether you're within that community looking on or whether you're outside of the community looking in. We're not very good at knowing how to handle little human frictions. We would more gladly leave a church in a puff of offense and indignation than to try and work out the differences that we have with others and seek restoration and reconciliation. Facing an opponent face to face is a scary thing. It takes courage. It's very difficult, but it's what grown-ups do. And it's the right thing to do. And it's God's command for us to do. And we're so bad at it. But today, this is what we're going to talk about. That's why I'm just kind of relaxed here, sitting on a chair, because this message is for us, for the church. And we're about to get real. So welcome to the Bible, My Cats and I. We're in Matthew chapter 18. We're moving right along, guys. This chapter is another one of those teaching sections, the discourses. Remember, we started with the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7 as discourse 1. That was the ethics of the kingdom. Then we have chapter 10, which is the mission of the kingdom, the instruction that Jesus gave for that. Then we moved to chapter 13, that was like the nature of the kingdom. We had all those parables. And now this is number 4, chapter 18. And we'll call it the governance of the kingdom, because it is sort of Jesus's bylaws for us. Also, I want you to notice that there are differences between this chapter and the chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. The instructions that Jesus gave, the ethics of the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount, were basically for all humankind, right? But that's what makes this chapter different. This one was written specifically for those who are within the church community or the faith community. So if you haven't read it yet, chapter 18, press pause, read through the chapter real quick. If you're an overachiever and have already done that, kudos on you. But here, instead of the type of lesson that I usually do where I try and give you an overall feel for the chapter and how it fits within the whole gospel. I've mentioned I try and also pick out tidbits that you can walk away with. Today, we are going to read through and deal with 3 verses of this entire chapter, because I think everything up to these 3 verses leads to them. And everything that happens afterwards is almost sort of like a commentary of those 3 verses. And they are so important to us, and we aren't very good at taking them to heart and acting on them. So that's why I felt it was important. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read those 3 verses. Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to read verses 15 through 17. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the 2 of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that, quote, every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. End quote. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. That's what we're going to deal with here in our little chat today. Up until now, everything seems to be about how to conduct yourself with humility and integrity, and especially with concern for others, especially those who are weaker than you. But let's admit it, sometimes things go awry. That's not the way that it plays out. And so these 3 verses are sort of how to deal with it when things don't go the right way and there's friction. So I'm going to go almost word by word through this thing and just explain. That's how I'm going to start out, and then we'll have a little discussion about it. But verse 15, if your brother or sister sins, is what mine says. Yours might just say brother. That word brother is a binary word that's used to mean a non-binary concept. So brother or sister, okay? Anyone. That's what we mean by brother. And it's not, by the way, neighbor, which you hear Jesus using neighbor a lot when he's talking about anyone else out there. But when the word brother or sister is used, that means within the faith community, within that family of God, your God sibling, when your brother or sister, okay? This is within the faith community. When they sin, well, let me define sin a little bit. It can be defined as unfaithfulness or living in immorality or living with hurtfulness towards others. Actually, I personally like to define sin as when a person is exploitive or hurtful or dehumanizing or oppressive to another. This then goes further to say, if your brother or sister sins against you, does your Bible have that? Mine actually doesn't. The NIV doesn't have that phrase, against you. And you might see a little bit of a note at the bottom of your Bible or in the margin that explains that term against you is actually not found in the earliest and the best manuscripts that we have. But it seems to have been added later for pretty good reasons, probably. Because, let's face it, there was some clarification needed here. If you just say, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, you're opening it up to anybody who wants to get into anybody's business and point out their faults, right? And we do that. Come on, that happens within the church. So I think eventually the church found it necessary to add those words against you. And so that sort of puts boundaries on it. If your brother or sister sins against you. So if it's involving your own business, your own personal circle of influence, that's when you can go to them. So this avoids us taking on the role of judge over all, right? Now, this does require some judgment. Let's face it, we are all responsible for other people, especially those who are weak. And yes, the church is to be tolerant, but it's not supposed to be indifferent. And so there are times when we need to worry about others, right? But I think this edition, like I said, just makes the point of saying that really we should only get into what is really within our own business. All right. Then you can go to them and go to them. You go to them. You go to them and point out their fault or their problem. This left by itself kind of has a tone of rebuking, like you go point out their problem. Okay, but there's a phrase that comes after. It says, just between the two of you. There you go. You go to them, just between the two of you, and you talk to them. This is the scary part, and this is the part that we don't like, do we? we don't want to remember this, and we don't want to recognize this as God's command, Jesus' command to us, that you go to them in person, just between the two of you, if you've got something wrong. And it's so important to remember, because listen, if you approach the other with humility, it respects them as a person. It gives them the chance to respond, gives them the chance to clarify, and it also gives them the chance to apologize if an apology is necessary. But there's another part to this too. If you keep it between the two of you, what if you're wrong? What if your judgment of what's going on is incorrect and that is clarified? How much better is it that you've just kept that between the two of you than that you have gone and told all these other people about your judgments, and then it was made clear that you were wrong? Okay, so this goes well for both of you on both sides. And then it says, and if they listen to you about what you have to say, you have won over your brother and sister. That means you have accomplished your goal in helping them to grow or in restoring the relationship. What could be better than that? But then it goes on to say, but if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that, and here's that quote, remember I said it was in quote, every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The reason why that's in quotes is it's actually quoting Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. You don't have to turn to it. I'll read it right here. It says this: one witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of a crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so that's what this is referring to. Once you've gone to them one-on-one, if they still don't listen to you, then you get witnesses. But you want to be really smart about this. You want to be smart about who you choose to bring with you. You want somebody who is going to be wise, somebody who's going to be self-controlled, someone who is going to not escalate the problem, and somebody who will be quite judicial in their commentary, but somebody who is wise enough to help each side, both you and the other person, communicate better. That's who you want to choose as your quote-unquote witnesses. And man, might I say that this really acts as a really good check on you and your own judgment as well, because if you can't find witnesses to go with you to talk to that person, that's a reality check on you, man. And you need to really take a look and maybe let it lie, right? If you can't get 2 other people to go with you and agree with your point of view, maybe you need to just let it lie. All right. I told you we were going to get real here. Then it says, if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. You know, that term, the church, this is, I think, only the second time that it's come up here in Matthew. It's not really a term that was used at the time that Jesus really said these words. There was no church at that time. There was no church until after Jesus resurrected. So Matthew is using a little bit of artistic license here as the author and what he has to say. He's using Jesus's teachings, and he uses this word in order to direct Jesus's teachings to the faith community. Okay, just wanted you to know that. Just pointing out that's not really a word that Jesus would have used for whatever it's worth. But if they won't listen to the witnesses, then you can take it to the church, and that also seems to be the church large community, or at least if you have a group of elders, if you have a board or something like that. We're going to talk about other ways that we could tend to take things to the church that aren't so good. And then it says, if they still refuse to listen, okay, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen to even the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. That sounds really dire, doesn't it? That sounds like, cast them out. Pagans, tax collectors. Well, that would have been sort of a Pharisaic way of understanding tax collectors and Gentiles or pagans, the untouchables, right? But think about Jesus. We're a Jesus community of faith. What would Jesus do? How did Jesus treat tax collectors and pagans? Think about that. And actually, the way that Jesus treated tax collectors and pagans, Gentiles, if you will, was with compassion, with patience, with inclusion, and to the point of seeking them out in order to bring them in, okay? So if we're to do this in the model after Jesus, to treat someone else like a pagan or a tax collector, we're still working at trying to restore that relationship and treating them with patience, with humility, with loving kindness. Okay, that's really important. Now, however, I believe that this part was included in to make a point. There is real evil. And if there is real evil involved in something like this, and that the person won't be humble enough to even listen to, any discussion or enter into any discussion, listen to any other witnesses and other points of view, for the sake of the community, for the sake of the church, sometimes we must, have that person leave. We must ask them to leave, or we must make them leave. Sometimes there even has to be a restraining order placed against them for the sake and the safety of all the members of the church. I've been in the ministry, in the church, for a long, long time, and I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen, and it's not comfortable. I got to tell you that. Sometimes not everything is restorable, but sometimes it is necessary. The church has the authority to discipline, and that is important, and it needs to be taken seriously. And when it's not, then we do at least have this as recourse. But we need to remember as the church that each disciple is a child of God, and we are all growing, and we all need discipline in order to grow. So the church can still provide that discipline. Now notice there's a difference between discipline and punishment. I'm talking about guidance. Guidance done with loving kindness and humility. That's how people grow. We call this the Bible, my cats and I, so once in a while I'll bring up examples of the cats. I'm not really a crazy cat lady, but it's kind of obvious. Like, the way to train Panger to not jump up on the counters is not necessarily throwing a book at him every time that happens. That is not going to be an effective way to discipline him out of a particular behavior. Instead, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of correction of picking him up, using the words no, putting him down on the ground, again and again and again, repeatedly, every once in a while using maybe a little squirt of water. Okay, I will go that far. But aggression is not going to help him to grow. And so this is true with humans as well. And we need to remember that it's okay to provide some guidance as long as it's done with loving kindness. So as I mentioned, it seems like this whole chapter is leading up to this passage right here, this little section on how to behave within the faith community with humility and loving kindness. But, often someone messes up, right? And so here's how to handle it. And first, you discipline yourself, right? But then you go in person to help others, to reach out to others. And this is only for helping a brother or sister within the faith community. And Jesus commands us that we confront this person personally. But what is it that we usually do? Let's be honest here. What do we usually do? The first thing we usually do is go and tell someone else. Now, in some cases, most cases I would say, we would go to who? We go to the pastor, right? Because we see the pastor as a parent figure. We pay for them. So we either think, somehow they need to talk to this other person and correct the situation. They need to provide, as the parent, they need to provide the discipline. Or we pay them so it's their job to fix it, right? So we go to the pastor in hopes that they're going to do the difficult confrontation work that Jesus is commanding us to do. It's our way of getting out of the responsibility, right? I'm sorry. I'm going to say this. First of all, don't go to your pastor. Jesus commands us we go directly. But if your pastor allows you to bring something like this to him, and he doesn't first instruct you to go yourself, then your pastor, him or herself, is going against the very commands of God. Ouch. And you should recognize that. If you ask your pastor to confront somebody else about their sins and your pastor agrees and takes it on, they're going against these commands right here. Okay, ouch. Now, who's another one that we might go to? Oh, just about anybody that we want to bring over to our side and our perspective of the whole situation. Folks, that's called gossip, okay? But we do it, and it's even worse. Gossiping doesn't even allow the other person a chance to clarify or to respond in any way. Like I said, it's like we tell others so that they will either be shocked or confirm that, oh, wow, yeah, that's wrong. And which puts us in the right then and there in their eyes, right? Shame on us. Shame that we should want others to come onto our side of the perspective before we go and talk to that other person one-on-one. Okay? And remember, we may be wrong. So if we're going out and we're telling other people about what this other person did, and then we find out that actually we were wrong, now everybody knows that we're wrong, so it can go against you. This reminds me of that old saying that maybe your grandmother taught to you. A person should be spoken with, not about. Okay? So ixnay on the osipgay. Go directly to the person. Our goal is to be humble and to seek to restore that person in a spirit of gentleness. It allows that other person a chance to respond or clarify or apologize. It treats them with respect. And as I said, we may find that we have misunderstood them and that actually we were in the wrong, and it gives us a chance to then apologize. I think the faith community's biggest problems stem from two things. From gossip within the family of God, and from allowing an offense a chance to fester. Now, this important passage of Jesus' teachings, when it's applied in a timely and wise manner, nips the problem in the bud, right? And if this is the area of the church's greatest problems, then I don't think we teach these 3 verses enough. And that's why I've zeroed in on it today. It takes courage. It takes humility. But as N.T. Wright said, this is severely practical. And we need to listen to Jesus' commands and realize their commands and act upon them. The steps are all laid out there for us. So I want you to ask yourself today, is there anyone who's caused you offense or quote unquote sinned against you, wronged you in any way? What might you do to respond to that situation in a way that would honor God's instructions right here in this chapter? Ask yourself that. The first thing would be Check yourself. Second thing would be go. Go and do. Just like these verses say. With that, I'll leave you. Grace be with you, and peace be among you.